right. So I think the subject of slavery is very intimidating when a Christian is being asked regarding this issue, and because of its, of course, the presupposition from the from the one who objects it, that slavery is the slavery of the Bible or in the Bible is evil. Is it normal to be intimidated by this kind of objections, Pastor?
It's it's intimidating to be challenged with any objection, especially one that seems difficult to understand. However, I can remove that intimidation very easily because there's one thing that I always practice.
Mm-hmm.
When someone makes a challenge, I ask a question. And if you do that, then there's no burden on you.
Mm-hmm.
If you think about it, the challenge is, how could the Bible be true? It supports slavery, right? It's coming as a challenge. Well, I'm going to ask a question instead of sitting there and trying to defend slavery, which I can do, and we'll discuss today. But I'm not in the position of having that burden.
Mm-hmm.
If they say that the Bible, condones slavery, there's a couple different ways I typically go. I'll first ask them to define slavery.
Yeah.
I'll ask them, what does slavery look like? Because for most people, when they talk slavery, they're thinking of like the African slave trade,
Mm-hmm.
or slavery where you have ownership of another human being,
Yep.
where they work as an indentured servant without pay.
Mm-hmm.
They have no rights.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the idea to have. And I will keep asking them to explain what their ideas of slavery until we get that worked out.
Mm-hmm.
There's a reason I'm going to do that. We could dig into this more during the show. But here's the thing. When they admit that, I'll say, oh, so what do you think about employment? I mean, is that indentured slavery and indentured servitude? Is that a slavery?
Mm-hmm.
Because at least in America, we ended up having the people in the South who worked outside used to refer to the people in the North that worked in industries, worked in buildings where they worked long hours for little pay.
Mm-hmm.
Back many years ago. They said that was voluntary slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Because they were having to work all these long hours for someone else to tell them how long to work and tell them how much they could get paid.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was an interesting view that they had of it. But the reason I do that is this reason. Because once they say that employment is not slavery, well, why is it not slavery? Well, it's not slavery because people they get paid. They can kind of pick and choose where they go,
Mm-hmm.
things like that. Now, this is going to be where we can make a difference between the slavery in the Bible and the slavery that we have that they're thinking of.
Mm-hmm.
See, what very few people that bring this question up realize is that slaves in the Bible had rights. Slaves in the Bible got paid a half day's wage.
Mm-hmm.
So they were not unpaid labor.
Mm-hmm.
They were paid labor. They didn't get paid as much. Why not? Because it was often they were paying off debt.
Mm-hmm.
It's often that they owed someone money,
Mm-hmm.
or they couldn't provide for themselves. They couldn't manage their money,
Mm-hmm.
and they rested on someone else to care for their housing, their health care, their food, all their needs. They just didn't get paid as much because part of the payment went toward their living and all that. A great example we have of really what that slavery would look like would be Japan in the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
After World War II, Japan had changed where you worked for a company and they owned everything. The Japanese companies owned your house. They paid for your clothes, your food, your healthcare, your education, everything. And the idea was if the company is paying for everything and owns everything, the better the company does, the better you do. You can get a better car. You can get better clothes. It all depends on how the company does. So people would be more likely to work
Mm-hmm.
for that company. That was the concept behind it. But they owned everything. You didn't pick up and leave the company.
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't do that easily. And they got to say how many hours you worked.
Mm-hmm.
And they got to say what you could do, but you got paid. That's closer to the biblical slavery. That's and no one would call what happened in Japan slavery. They call that industry.
Mm-hmm.
And so I avoid a lot of the tension there, because what I'm going to start doing is just asking them questions with the goal of getting to that point, of getting them to actually admit what they think slavery is,
Mm-hmm.
and then ask them, did you know that slaves in the Bible got paid a half day's wage? Did you know that slaves in the Bible aren't treated as property in the, so they're going to argue for slavery being ownership, but that's not what we see in the Bible. In the Bible, if in biblical times, if you lost, say, a cow, say you had a cow, he wanders into my property, I have a legal responsibility according to biblical law to return that cow. But if you have a slave that runs away, don't have that same biblical responsibility because a person is not property. And so I don't return the person that runs away like I would a cow. And see, they don't study that out. They don't know those things.
So, by definition, what is biblical slavery?
Well, I would say biblical slavery is more of an employment system. You had a couple of reasons that people would be slaves. It was usually and people will often look as if slavery was the worst thing ever. If you get the book 12 Years a Slave, this is written by a man who was born in New York. He was a free African-American here in the United States. He went down to D.C. to make some money, play music. He was a violinist. He was kidnapped there and forced into slavery. Now, the first place that he was a slave to a Christian man. And he actually writes in the book, had he remained there his entire life, he would not have thought slavery to be a bad thing. But he was sold to another plantation where they mistreated people. And everyone looks at slavery as if it is always the worst possible way of living. And yet, in biblical law, we see that there are rules for the slave owners to care for slaves. They had responsibility to provide for them and make sure that they're well cared for. Not to mistreat them. There would be rules against the mistreating of them. So what you end up seeing in biblical slavery is the focus on it is on the responsibility of the master to the slave, to respect him and to follow rules. And so biblical slavery, typically people would get themselves into slavery. Maybe the Israelites took over a land and they would basically kill the men in warfare. Well, in a time where women didn't work, the only way to provide for those in the land that are left is employment system, and that is what's called slavery. So they would be employed and provided for. Now, people say, "Oh, but they were slaves for life." Yes, it meant that owners, the masters, would have, because they overtook that land and own that land. Now they had a responsibility to provide for those families for the remainder of their life, because they would have no other means. So it's to protect them from poverty. Another way you'd have people going into slavery is when they would get themselves in debt. They would sell themselves or family members, and what ends up happening there is that person would be working until they work off their debt. Now there was provisions where someone might say, I prefer working for my master, and so they would become a slave for life. In other words, they may recognize that they don't have a means of employment. The master's taking care of me. I'm gonna be a slave for the rest of my life for him. And so they would remain that way, and the master would continue to provide for him. It's more than the provision you have at a company that you work for, where they just give you a paycheck. Here they're providing your food, your lodging, your clothing, anything you need. That's their responsibility. And so it's a little different than what people often think of slavery, because they focus on the slave. They focus on, well, they don't have rights. They're just property. They're not treated as humans. And that's not what biblical slavery would be. It's the responsibility of a master to take care of all the needs of the person and there are people who just don't know how to manage finances. There's people who don't know how to provide for themselves, and they overspend, they get in debt, and they get in trouble. And it's actually in the Bible, what we see as slavery is a protection against poverty. Because if they didn't have the system of slavery, what would happen with these people? Here in the United States, we see what happens when you have no system like that. They didn't live on the streets. You didn't see that in Israel. Why? Because they had a system to protect them.
Hmm. So, have you ever encountered someone or engaged someone and then raised this kind of objection? How did you handle it?
Oh, I get this all the time. Remember, I do open air evangelism on the
Mm-hmm.
streets in
Mm-hmm.
well, even in the Philippines. I got to do something I can never do here in the United States. We went to a mall,
Mm-hmm.
one of the malls there in the Philippines in Manila, and actually set up a amplifier
I think I have
in their
watched that.
corridors.
Mm-hmm. I think
Yeah,
I've
three
watched that.
stories up. I was actually preaching the gospel inside a mall. I can't do that in the United States. It was great. You know, everyone's like hanging down. I'm looking up as preaching, and they're hanging down listening. But I go around the country preaching
Mm-hmm.
on the streets the gospel, and I will get this a lot. There's two things that come up the most. The biggest thing used to be, can you trust the Bible? In
Mm-hmm.
different forms, as I mentioned earlier. A second biggest thing is slavery. Used to be, at least. Now, the number one thing that's coming up almost every time is homosexuality. That comes up almost every time now.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
slavery is now kind of bumped to 3. But I get this regularly. And really, the way to handle it is asking them questions, challenging them, and then seeing how much they actually know about the scriptures. Now, what they're going to do, there's a couple passages they always turn to. There's a passage.
Yep. Exodus
In,
21.
yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. They're always going to go to that. And because what they're looking, it seems in their mind to be like the ultimate proof, because what you end up having in Exodus 21 to 25,
Mm-hmm.
you have the laws of slavery. And there it's going to talk about this case where, okay, you get a Hebrew slave and a Gentile slave. So the
Mm-hmm.
Gentile slave, you have someone who comes in. Israel's come in, they've conquered a land. There's people who are there. So you have this woman who has no other means of providing for herself or her children. And so she is a slave.
Mm-hmm.
In the case here, she's unmarried, and you get a Hebrew slave. And by the way, here's the thing with the Hebrew slaves and this is, again, something you bring up with them, is to show how little they understand slavery.
Mm-hmm.
In Israel, there was a year of Jubilee. Every 7 years, all debts were freed. So if you had a slave who's a slave because he owes someone money, but that money hasn't been paid off, by the time of the Jubilee,
Mm-hmm.
all debts are free. All slaves that are there for debt are released.
Wow.
So it's not this view that they have of not having rights and things like that. You see, there's all these laws protecting people.
Yeah.
And protecting the slaves and the responsibility of the masters. So if you have a Hebrew slave who ends up becoming a slave, he gets himself in debt, finds another slave who's a Gentile, and he decides he wants to marry her,
Mm-hmm.
he can marry her. But when the Jubilee year is up, the Hebrew slave is allowed to leave, but the master still has an overriding responsibility to protect and provide for that wife.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, even if they have children, that responsibility is for the children as well. And so what ends up happening is that the Hebrew man has a choice. He can leave. He's free. But what the scriptures say is he has to leave alone. Why? Because he got himself in debt to start with, which exposes that he may not be someone who can care for the wife and children without the provision of the master.
Mm-hmm.
So the protection that's provided for the Gentile woman and her children remains with the master, not to the husband, who already has displayed a failure to handle his finances. And so now the Hebrew has a choice. He can leave alone, and the wife and children still are under the headship of the master, or he can remain a slave, give up that freedom of Jubilee and remain a slave,
Mm-hmm.
and stay with his wife. And people think that that's a very strange text. because it seems like that they're being a slave in it, that it's causing divorce, but it's a protection law. And that's the thing we have to understand. It's a responsibility issue that the master has. Now, the other one that people will say when it comes to slavery is you have a master who they come into a land. You have a woman who husband died in warfare. And what ends up happening there is as that occurs, you end up seeing that there will be times where someone's going to be attracted to a woman or want a woman as a wife who was a slave, and he will take her. Now, it's very interesting because people will say, oh, like here you got people, they pillage a land, they rape the women, and then they just take them as wives, but they're slaves, and they can't do anything. Well, actually, they're making them a wife, and there's rules there. If a man does that, he's never allowed to divorce her. He has to always treat her as a wife. He can't let her go. And so it's not the way that they always picture it or explain it. Like he rapes a woman, then she's forced to marry the rapist, and then she's just a slave, and he can cast her aside. No, he can't cast her aside. In fact, if he casts her aside, he's got to give her the money of an endowment so she could provide for herself. This is the thing that you end up seeing is most of the people don't understand what the protections were. And they don't see it as a protection system. They see it as a system of ownership of another human being. Now, let me you ask how I deal with it. Here's something I do. I do this often. And I don't know if this will work. I don't know what the position is in your country with the issue of abortion. But what I typically will do when someone brings up this issue, I will challenge them, and I'll ask them, why is slavery wrong? I will get them to a point where what I want them to say is that it is wrong to say you own another human being. And I'll say, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with saying this is my property? And I really want them to argue against the issue of this is my property. I was outside of an abortion clinic preaching the gospel. We were there all day, but there was only one person who got the police called on them, and it was me. And it's because they had an African-American gentleman standing outside of the door so that he could usher the women in. And I was saying, and they could hear me inside, I said, sir, what's wrong with slavery? Do you have issues against slavery? And he said, yes. I said, what's wrong with it? He says, it's wrong to say you can own another human being. I said, why? He said, because people don't have a right to own other human beings. I said, what is wrong with saying this is my property if you paid for something? Now, it sounds like I'm arguing for slavery, which I kind of am. And that gets them to really want to defend their view. And so when they start saying it is wrong to say this is my property, then I turn to them and say, well, then explain one thing to me, sir. What is the difference between saying this is my property and this is my body? Every woman who goes into that clinic says, this is my body and I can kill another human being because I have ownership over that human being. There is the only difference between slavery and abortion is that slaves were not always mistreated and they lived. Abortion is the same argument that they are against with slavery, but it always leads in death. Well, most of the time leads in death unless it's botched. And so I will take their argument and show that they're hypocritical because the majority of people that are going to challenge me on the slavery issue support abortion. In fact, I'll play a clip if you want.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is what happened. We have a well-known atheist here in where we live in this country named David Smalley. And he was doing a debate with a friend of mine, Matt Slick. And it came time for Q&A. Their whole argument was on the issue that the Bible is immoral, and his whole argument was on morality, and he focused on slavery the whole time. Now, he and I talked beforehand. He knew exactly what my argument was because we talked about the abortion issue. And this is what he said. when I got up to ask a question.
Mr. Smalley, do you believe that abortion is moral?
Oh boy. I'm glad I'm debating him instead of you.
Because he knew he had no he knew that his whole argument, when I made the case to him, there were even atheists in that room that went, oh, because they realized they want to support abortion. And he did. He tried to argue for abortion. But I said, it's an ownership issue. You're taking a position that you can own another human being. That human being inside the mother's womb has a totally different DNA, could have a totally different gender, okay, is a completely separate human being.
Yep.
Just they're inside of the womb. But when you say you can kill that human being, that is an ownership issue.
Yep.
It's no different than the slavery they are against.
Wow, that was amazing. So basically the problem about this objection is the lack of understanding of the biblical slavery because of their interpretation, which is the 20th century or 17th to 20th century chattel slavery or African slavery, right?
For the most part, but that's what a lot of people are most familiar with, but slavery has been part of the work system, employment system, as far as we know from antiquity. I mean, you've always had cultures that ended up employing some form of slavery. You can go back in, even in scripture, we go back to Egypt and we see that. We see that the Israelites were slaves in Egypt. So there was always a form of slavery. Now, slavery was a work system, an employment system, and yet we have to recognize the fact that even though this system was in place, not all cultures practiced it the same way, right? So we see that there were laws for Israel. We don't think of slavery the same way, I think, in the 21st century.
Yep.
Because we think we have more rights. We can go and find a job somewhere. If we don't like working for this company, we just move to this company. But ultimately, they pay us. They tell us how long we're going to work if we want to get that paycheck. Now, we have a little bit more freedom in most countries that we can pick up and go somewhere else. But we also don't have the protections that come with that system. Now, it always comes down to where you can have abuse. And that's always the problem. That's why the Bible has restrictions on what can happen to protect people. And so that's why I think you always had slavery. As far back as we have recorded history, we see that there's been slavery. So the question is why? Well, because there's some people who can take care of themselves and others, and some who can't. And the people who can't, if you don't help them and take care of them and provide work and things like that, what ends up happening is they go into poverty. So which is better? I mean, you look around the world and you look at the countries that don't have a system to protect, the poor. They're going to have either a large number of poor. The countries that try to protect the poor, like they have welfare states over in Europe, and you end up seeing that over time, it ends up being such a drain on the system that the countries end up collapsing over time. We in this country, my country, have even the worst of both worlds, because we're trying to be a welfare state, taking care of the poor while having open borders, having everyone come in. And there's never been a country that has been able to successfully do that. Countries that have welfare states usually have closed borders. Countries that have open borders typically don't have a welfare state. America used to not have a welfare state. We said you come in and you work, but we didn't have provision. If people couldn't take care of themselves, it was a well type of attitude. There was no protection for them.
So is that concept of protection the same as insurance in our institution?
I never thought of it, but yeah, it would be in a sense. It's
yeah.
I mean, the difference being is we pay insurance,
and the protection from biblical slavery is free, right?
Yeah, and well, we pay insurance and we hope that they're going to pay us when when things go bad.
Yeah,
COVID
unfortunately.
changing that for a lot of people. I have friends who are, we're doing a trip to Israel. Striving for Eternity is doing a trip to Israel in 2021, and the trip sold out. But if anyone wants to get on that waiting list, go to 2021israeltrip.com. We got people coming from all over the world, Ireland, Mexico, everywhere. It's really kind of neat. Canada, America, and so it'll be Justin Peters and I leading things. And really, what we noticed with that is this whole COVID-19. We were talking about the insurance with the guy who's running it. He goes, let's not get the insurance yet, because after COVID-19, we don't know which insurance companies are going to still be in business because they're just paying out too much.
Yep.
And so, it is a thing where let's take that, for example. Like, it's not really an insurance thing, but what happened here in America was we have a president who said, to not overwhelm the healthcare system, we're going to try to tell everyone to stay home and not go to work. We're going to tell businesses to either shift where their employees can work at home or, shut down. And because the government was forcing it, the government said, well, we're going to have to come up with money to pay people to keep their employees, paid. So you got money for 2 months to keep people on salary. Well, since the government was the one shutting down the businesses, this president said, well, it's the government's responsibility to pay for this, to, make good on the damages that they're inflicting. What do you have happen? Well, there's just not enough money to go around to everywhere. And, they did put restrictions and penalties on big businesses that didn't need the money. So they were like, no, we'll give money back. But there's a bunch of small businesses that just didn't have money to pay for employees and said, you know what, I've got to open my business. You may have this law, but I have to feed my family. I have to have my employees feed their family. And so, we had one woman who opened a hair salon so she could feed her family and her employees could get paid. And, she said, and they arrested her. And she said, if you got to put me in jail, you put me in jail, but I'm not shutting down my salon because, my employees need to eat. Well, what happened there? She got sentenced to 7 days in prison. She was willing to do that so that she could take care of the people who worked for her. That's a responsibility as a business owner that she had. Same as that you'd have with a master that has slaves. They have a responsibility to make sure they take care of people.
Oh, right. Thank you so much for that very informative explanation. So, how about in the New Testament? They're quoting verses like Ephesians, obey your masters, etc., etc., and link that verses to chattel slavery. Do we have the same response to them in regard to that kind of objection?
Well, I think here we get into something very interesting because you'll sometimes find, are you familiar with Andy Stanley down there?
Yep.
You know who he is?
Yep.
Okay. My condolences. Sorry that we spread our bad theology around the world.
Yeah.
But Andy Stanley is one who tried to say we need to unhinge the Old Testament from the New Testament. One of the things he doesn't like about the Old Testament is that it talks about slavery. He doesn't like that very much. And I've been meaning to do a podcast on this on my Rappaport podcast. Eventually I'm going to do this. But when he was talking about unhinging the Old Testament from the New, his argument was he did not like that because of the fact that here he has the Old Testament that refers to things like slavery, and that's just so wrong. And so I did a little research. How many New Testament books refer back to the Old Testament, and which books would we have left if we unhinge all of the Old Testament and remove all the New Testament books that refer back to the the Old Testament? Well, I discovered we would but only have one New Testament book that doesn't refer to the Old Testament at all, doesn't allude to it or anything. It happens to be the only book dealing with slavery. That's right, Philemon, the one chapter, that one book. And what's the whole purpose of Philemon? The whole purpose of Philemon is that here Paul is writing to Philemon, who had a slave who ran away, and he's saying to him, listen, your slave who ran away, he may even owe you some money. His name's Onesimus. He came to me. He got saved. He's been very valuable to me. And you owe me, Philemon, because, you know, I'm the one that led you to Christ. So you owe me. Well, you can put his debt on my account. So he's basically sending Onesimus back to Philemon. Very interesting. And it's the only book that doesn't have any allusions back to the Old Testament. So Andy Stanley would be left with one book of the New Testament, and it would be a book all about slavery. So I don't know that he exactly wants to unhinge the Old Testament from the New.
So that's the idea of Andy Stanley, why he wants to unhinge the Old Testament from the New, because of the issue of slavery.
It seems to be the biggest thing that he has issue with. I mean, I think the other things that he would have issues with, he doesn't like the fact that the Israelites went to war. I mean, basically what it is he doesn't like, in his 21st century sensibility, he doesn't like things he reads in the Bible. But those were the things that happened in those days. I mean, is he going to unhinge himself from America because of the African slave trade, which he doesn't like? I mean, is that a logical way to go about things, to try to rewrite history and ignore the actual events of things? So I just think he's got a system he can't hold to consistently. But what you end up seeing in the New Testament is, yes, you have Paul telling slaves to remain slaves. You have him sending Onesimus back to his master. Now, remember, this is a Roman slave under Roman rules. So in Roman rules, a slave was property. Philemon could have had the right in Roman law to kill, if he so desired, Onesimus, especially since Onesimus, it seems, stole money from him when he left. Paul sends him back. Why? Because to Paul, what was more important is the gospel and the issue of restoration, forgiveness, things like that, reconciliation. And so you end up seeing that there's a lot more lessons that we have that Philemon and Onesimus need to learn. In fact, historically, we do see that there seems to be a church leader named Onesimus. So there actually is the possibility that even though Onesimus was a slave to Philemon, when they got to church, it may be that Onesimus was a leader over Philemon. Be a real interesting situation of how that works out. But that is the reality. You have to recognize the fact that the Bible, in the New Testament, you see Paul talking about submission. You brought up Ephesians.
Yep.
Well, where's it mentioned in Ephesians 5 and 6? And you can't just say 6. Why? Because it starts in 5:20. The thing that people forget, and this is a passage many people know, because they are going to talk about husbands, love your wives, submit to your children. And they never start in verse 21. They start in verse 22. 22 says, wives, submit to your husbands. Okay, well, where do we see submission there? Oh, just one verse before. Submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ, wives submit to their own husbands. And then later he's going to be talking about slaves obey your earthly masters in chapter 6, verse 5. So this whole thing from that you end up seeing that starts in chapter 2, verse 15, and works its way all the way down to chapter 6, verse 9, is all the concept of mutual submission that we have. He's talking about that within the church, we submit to one another, husbands to wives, wives to husbands, husbands to wives, children to parents, parents to children, fathers do not provoke your children to anger,
Yep.
slaves to masters, masters to slaves. You know, he's basically what Paul is doing there is he's talking about a mutual submission that we have within the church, and it affects all realms, whether you're spouses, parents to children, masters to slaves. Every type of relationship that we have, we should be having mutual submission to one another in the church. That's the thing. Paul's laying all that out. He's not just giving a statement, but breaking that down. So yes, how would that attribute to us? When we go to work, we are to submit to our employers. If we're the employer, we are to submit in the sense to our employees, to care for them, provide for them. We have a responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
We have to take care of their needs. Now in America, we see this breakdown because those that are at the top have now, you know, they've been able to give themselves more and have less of a concern for the people that work for them. So they protect themselves over their people. They actually, if we were applying biblical rules, they would have a responsibility to make sure that their people are taken care of. You know, you do see this with something. I mean, like our current president doesn't take a salary. He's got enough money. And so he has decided he's not going to take the $800,000 a year that is allotted for him. He put that back into the government so that we wouldn't need to do as much taxation. Mm-hmm. That is the way someone should do. I remember the story. There was a car manufacturer, Lee Iacocca was the head of it, and he had made enough money. The company wasn't doing well, and he just said, "I'm going to take a $1 salary per year." That's all he made was $1. Mm-hmm. And you know, that way. He wasn't making the big money and everyone else could be employed. That was a responsibility. That would be a biblical practice that people at top would see that they have a responsibility to take care of their employees. Mm-hmm. That's the view of biblical slavery.
Do you think why chattel slavery exists in our time is because of the when people start to depart from the scriptures?
I think that chattel slavery is because people have a sin nature. Mm-hmm. If you give them a position where they can feel that they can control another human being, mm-hmm. they will do that. Mm-hmm. There's plenty of examples throughout history mm-hmm. where people, once they get control over another human being, will try to exert that control mm-hmm. and try to get more for themselves. That's because we have a sin nature. Mm-hmm. That's the reason we need biblical principles, yep. because the biblical principles are to protect against our sin nature, to protect other people, because we recognize that these people that you have are a responsibility to care for, not to take advantage of. Mm-hmm. Chattel slavery is nothing more than one person wanting to control another person.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So whenever someone is trying to bring up that kind of objection, all we want to do as a Christian is that ask them what slavery means.
I think your internet may be going out.
Oh.
I didn't hear the question. Sorry, the internet went out for a bit there.
Oh, I'm sorry. So let me repeat the question.
Needs a backup.
Cover me. So basically, when someone tries to object regarding slavery in the context of 20th or 21st century slavery, we Christians should really ask the objector, what do you mean by slavery, in order for us to really have this kind of clarification, both sides, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's a good book, if you guys could get a hold of it, is called Tactics by Greg Koukl. And the reason I always recommend this, I years ago, I was going to write a book on evangelism, and I realized most of what I teach is in his book. You know, so when he came out with it, I just recommend people get that. But it teaches you how to ask questions and what the purpose of questions are.
Yep.
If someone challenges you, ask questions. You can ask questions to gather information. Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that? What do you mean by slavery? What is slavery? Why is it wrong? Those are information gathering questions. Or it could be to expose them, as when I start asking them, why is slavery wrong? Because you're against ownership of another human being. Then do you support abortion? That's exposing a problem. I mean, you heard the reaction that David Smalley had. He didn't want to have to deal with that in front of hundreds of people, right?
Yeah.
He was trapped with that. And that's what that question did. It exposed a problem that he knew he had, that he wanted to avoid. And so you can ask questions that expose. Now, when I'm doing that, is there any pressure on me? No. There's none, because I'm not the one having to answer. If they make a claim, you ask a question. Then there's no pressure on you. I had a guy in New York that, was telling me that there is no God because there's evil in the world.
The
And I said,
problem
well,
of evil.
yeah. And I said, well, explain this to me. How could you have evil without God? See, I think evil is the best argument for God. And, but he said, well, what's evil? He's now asking me a question. And I said, sir, I didn't say evil exists. You did. You see, he wants to put the burden back on me. And I said, no, you said evil exists. You said we can't have God because there's evil in the world. What is evil?
Yep, exactly.
And he didn't have a definition for evil. He kept asking me, what's evil? What's evil? So after a couple of times, I said, okay, evil is the absence of good, and good is defined by the nature of God. How can you have evil without God? And in a crowd of people, he just threw his hands up and left the crowd because he had no answer.
But many people don't like that answer, though. In the Christian perspective, right? In fact, they don't accept that.
It doesn't matter if they accept it.
Yep.
I mean, what criminal accepts that they're guilty when they stand before a judge?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, they're always pleading their innocence. It doesn't matter whether we like it or not. The fact is if you define evil by anything else other than the nature of God, then you have a subjective standard, and therefore you can never hold your standard against another person. Therefore, every single country that has prisons would be wrong, because the guilty person justifies his behavior. And therefore, if you have a subjective standard, you can't say you're wrong and I'm right. It can't be. Yep. You have to have an absolute standard. So why is lying wrong? Because God is not a liar. Why is stealing wrong? Because God is not a thief.
Amen.
Why is raping wrong? Because God is not a rapist. You see, it all goes back to the nature of who God is. God is good. Evil is the opposite of that, the lack of good. Like darkness is the lack of light. Evil is the lack of good.
So, what do you think is the relationship between the Old Testament and the biblical slavery and the gospel?
Well, I think what we'd see in the relationship to biblical slavery and the gospel would be this, is that, God recognizes the sinful nature of people, that people would, in this sin nature, would do what we see around the world, that they would want to own other people, control other people, and make everyone submit to themselves, because as we see in Genesis 3, human beings want to think that they could be like God. And they feel that when they feel that they can own another human being or force another human being to bow down to them and do what they wish. And because of that, it shows the sin nature that we have. It shows that God is right, that we are sinners, and God had to put protections on people. God had to provide a way for people to not do, to know that they're accountable to someone greater than themselves, and that's God himself. And when we break God's law, which we all do, we're accountable to God. And that's why God himself had to come to earth. God himself had to come to earth to die on a cross, to be a payment of sin that you and I, Jordan, we can never pay. You and I can never pay a consequence that is forever. And so because of that, God, being an eternal being, is the only one that could pay that fine. Being a human being, he could pay for men. That's what makes Jesus unique. What makes Christianity unique. Christianity is not a system of morality. Christianity is a system of Christ. It's based on a very special person
Amen.
who's truly God and truly man. Being truly God, he can pay the fine of eternity and pay it for all people. For being a man, he can pay that for people. And so what you see here is that Christ is, because of his death, it is sufficient for all, because he is eternal. But he provided that because we're sinners, because we have that need. Left to our own devices, we would continue in sin and rightly deserve an eternity in a lake of fire. But God made a way of escape. He himself came to earth, died on the cross that we could be set free, that we turn from trusting ourselves or trusting our good works, turn and trust Jesus Christ. That's the gospel. We can have the forgiveness of sins. Or as Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 5:21, he who knew no sin became sin that we might become the righteousness of God. Amen. So Christ took the punishment of sin upon himself and then calls us righteous. That blows my mind.
Yeah.
But that's the view. Now, here's the thing. What does Scripture say? What does Paul say in Romans? You and I are born slaves to sin. And when we turn to Christ and repent of our sin, we become slaves to Christ. Notice, he uses that same mindset of slavery that we see God putting in the Old Testament. In other words, we have a duty to our master. Now, in this case, the way Paul's using it is the worldly, the cattle slavery concept. We are enslaved to sin. It controls us. But when we come to Christ, he should control us. And we put old things away. We put away that sinful lifestyle. We have to stop doing that and be a slave to sin and live every day thinking that way. Now, it's taken down now because I'm packing up and moving. I have this cover here because I don't want you to see an empty bookcases behind me because my books are practicing separation. My books are quarantined.
I would like
they're
to have
all in
one.
Boxes, and they're practicing social distancing. Yeah, they're practicing social distancing for me right now. It's sad. I don't have my books. It's really hard because I'm preaching and I'm like, I don't have all my commentaries. So, but the thing is that as we look at what the gospel message is, I have this note that used to be on my desk here, and it says, "You are a slave. Serve your master." As a constant reminder to myself that when I became a Christian, yes, I was no longer a slave to sin, but it doesn't mean I'm not a slave
anymore. Yeah.
I am still a slave. I'm just a slave to Christ. And I have a responsibility as a slave to serve my master the way he wants me to serve, to the best of my ability. And that's the message for a Christian. To the unbeliever, then you're still a slave to sin. That sin controls you all the time. No, I'm going to live my life my way. I'm enjoying my sin. No, you're not. That sin is leading to death.
Yeah, it has
consequences. Yeah, but they don't know the freedom that they can have with the forgiveness of sin because they don't see that. They only understand what it's like to be a slave to sin. And you don't understand the freedom you have in forgiveness until you're forgiven.
That's a problem because they see African slavery as wrong, but they did not see themselves as slaves of sin. These people are very self-righteous. Yeah,
well, that is true. That's what I was just preaching on that in Mark this week at church. The self-righteousness of the Pharisees, that they could see Jesus eating with tax collectors and sinners, and then they're like, "You're a teacher with sinners," as if they're not one. You know, and Jesus' response: "I came for the sick, not the a physician comes to the sick, not the righteous." Like, you know, I the thing I had said on Sunday was, Jesus says this statement, and they don't even realize what he's saying about that. Your righteousness is based in yourself. You have that claim, but God doesn't agree with your assessment.
Exactly. Well, I guess I'm done with my questions. Before we close this conversation, any advice from the young Christians out there uh, about handling these kind of objections in regard to biblical slavery or slavery in
Well,
particular?
it really comes down to learning how to interpret the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
What I would say is you could go, if you go to strivingforeternity.org, look under our academy, we have a 20 classes on how to interpret the Bible, how to study the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And so free of charge, you could take them.
Mm-hmm.
If you want the syllabus, I'd recommend you contact Rock of Refuge Church with Pastor Armand. He has the rights to reprint them there in the Philippines because it costs less to print them there
Mm-hmm.
than for us to print them and ship them over. It makes it too expensive. We don't want that. So, but that'd be one thing I'd recommend, because the thing we have to do, what's really at issue here with biblical slavery is you must interpret rightly. In other words, you must understand what the slavery was at that time,
Mm-hmm.
understand the purpose of it, understand the culture. So we can't read our 21st century thinking into the Bible. We have to understand the culture and the history and the time at that time of the writing, what was being said, what was the purpose of it, and then understand it that from their perspective, and then bring it into our day.
Mm-hmm.
That's what hermeneutic is, the science of interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
That's what's lacking in many churches, and that's why so many people, this is a struggle for them, because they don't look at it from the biblical perspective of seeing it as a responsibility of the masters to take care of the slaves. They look at it, as you said, cattle slavery, with it being unfair to the slave.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that's a big thing people could do. I think if you go to Need God, the group on Facebook.
Yep. Need for God. Mm-hmm.
No, it's I think it's Need God
Need God.
Philippines.
Yeah, need God. Need God.
Go to needgod.ph, and that's the website. But from there, on their page, I think they have some of the teachings that we did when we were in Cebu. And so when we did the snatch them from the flames, and that is going to be there. There should be a video on Facebook, at least, that's there from the one teaching that I did. But let me let your audience know of a different thing. And that is, if you go to strivingforeternity.org, on the front page is a link to online events. And if you go there, you can register May 30th. The same, for those who may have missed when Justin and I were in the Philippines, we're going to be doing that same seminar online. It's the Snatch Them from the Flames home edition. So
that's great.
we're going to, because we're all at home. It started with Justin and I Justin called me up one day. He goes, how's your speaking schedule look? And I went, all free. It cleared up everywhere around the world. And he's like, mine too. And so we were like, what should we do about this? And he said, let's do an event that doesn't cost anyone anything. Everyone's at home anyway. People can't get out. My encouragement is use this time of quarantine for those who are stuck at home, get into the Bible, read and study, so that the moment we get out, we hit those streets, sharing the gospel as much as we can, that maybe God would use this COVID-19 to bring about a worldwide revival.
Amen.
That would be wonderful to see. But it's on us as believers to start studying now and preparing and getting ready to share the gospel, to answer the questions of biblical slavery and things like that. But May 30th, if you want to register, just go to the strivingforeternity.org, go to online events there, and from there you can register. You'll see a video that you can watch it right there. You'll be able to watch it free. There's no charge. It's going to be all day on May 30th. For you guys, you're going to have to decide to sleep during the day and stay up at night. We're going to start. It'll be, for you in the Philippines, it'll be starting at 10 o'clock your time.
No problem.
And run through 6 in the morning. So, for your night owls, it's going to be great. You have something to do while the rest of the Philippines sleep. But the nice thing is, it's all going to be, we'll end up putting it onto YouTube. And so it'll be there so that you'll be able to watch it. And so that's something that we're doing, taking advantage of the time when everyone's home, to help basically get Christians, take advantage of the fact that they're all kind of stuck at home, to equip them so that they're ready to, when this quarantine lifts.
Okay. Thank you so much for that very wonderful gospel presentation there, and of course, for that very short advice yet very encouraging. Well, I guess it's already 1 hour, and that's the limit of my commitment to this day. Oh, this day. So this evening. And I would like to thank you for granting this conversation. I hope this is not the last time we'll be doing this, Pastor Andrew.
No, I'd be happy to come back.
Okay.
Always want to encourage Christian podcasters. That's why we have the Christian podcast community,
Mm-hmm.
because we want to encourage people to be out there and podcasting. So let's just change that background. Look, see how quick I could do that? That was
Wow.
nice.
That was nice.
See the background now?
Yeah.
Christian podcast community. Just flip that.
Is that
But,
available?
Yeah,
is that
maybe
available,
we'll have to.
Is that available in strivingforeternity.org?
Yeah, well, you can get to all the podcasts there. You could go to christianpodcastcommunity.org as well, and it'll get you to all the shows. We even have, if people who want good Christian podcasting, they could actually subscribe to the Christian Podcast Community podcast feed. It's its own feed. So every one of the podcasts that host with us will be on that feed. So you could listen to one feed and get a whole lot of podcasts.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you so much for that. Well, I guess it's time for us to say goodbye for now.
Thanks for having me.
Okay. Pastor
Appreciate it.
Andrew Rappaport, thank you so much for having me here. So, for those people watching, don't forget to follow Pastor Andrew Rappaport on YouTube, strivingforeternity.org. Visit all the contents there. Those podcasts and contents will be very helpful for us young Christians. So, thank you so much, and have a